A wedding that began with vows and ended in silence. Welcome to Midnight Confessions. I am your host, Danny. I love hearing from you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Your stories make this mystery come alive. Let's begin. It was, by all accounts, meant to be the most charming wedding St. Mary Mead had seen in years. The early June sun filtered through the lacework of the elms bordering St. Margaret's Church, dappling the gravel path where villagers gathered in their Sunday best. There was a hum of cheerful gossip about the flowers, roses from Mrs. Bantry's garden, the cake from Mrs. Crump's bakery, 3 tiers and a scandalous amount of buttercream, and of course, about the bride herself. Miss Eliza Trent was not a native of St. Mary Mead, but she had made quite the impression since her arrival 6 months earlier. A striking woman in her late 20s with a confident manner and a mysterious air, she had quickly become the subject of much tea-time speculation. Her upcoming marriage to Harold Pennington, a well-liked solicitor from the next parish, had been the talk of every drawing-room for weeks. Miss Marple, sitting in her usual pew, observed the scene with mild amusement. She had a particular fondness for weddings, not for the pageantry, but for the fascinating array of human behavior they inevitably unveiled. The nervous groom, the fluttering bridesmaids, the sharp-eyed mothers whispering judgments behind gloved hands. It was, in its own way, a play about truth and appearances, a topic Miss Marple knew all too well. The organ began to play softly. The vicar, Reverend Lawrence, shuffled his notes. A hush fell over the congregation, but the bride did not come. 5 minutes passed, then 10. A restless murmur spread. The best man, young Peter Latham, Harold's clerk, darted toward the vestry, his face pale. Mrs. Pennington, the groom's mother, fanned herself furiously, muttering something about flighty modern women. The groom stood stiffly at the altar, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the great wooden doors. And then, the scream. It came from outside, near the churchyard gate. Every head turned. Moments later, a breathless maid burst through the entrance, her face white as the lilies on the altar. "It's Miss Trent, sir. She's lying in the vestry garden. She's not moving." Miss Marple did not rise immediately. Instead, she folded her hands neatly over her handbag and watched the ripple of panic that followed. The way people react in moments of shock, she often reflected, was far more revealing than any confession. It was in the small gestures, the averted eyes, the instinctive excuses, that truth liked to hide. When she finally joined the others at the garden gate, she found the scene already crowded. The bride lay upon the stone path in her white dress, the veil crumpled beside her, one gloved hand outstretched as if reaching for the church door. The bouquet had rolled into a puddle nearby, its petals darkened by mud. The doctor, Dr. Haynes, a brisk man with a perpetually reddened nose, knelt beside the body. "She's gone," he said softly. "Neck broken, I should think. A fall, perhaps." But Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as a sparrow's, noted something else. The faint trace of crushed moss on the stones near the garden wall, the slightly twisted position of the bride's wrist, and the look of frozen surprise upon her face. No, Miss Marple thought quietly. Not a fall. Something much darker than that. And somewhere among the whispers and gasps of the onlookers, amid the murmurs of "poor girl" and "such a tragedy," the old lady from the vicarage tea circle felt the first unmistakable stirring of curiosity. "Strange," Miss Marple murmured softly. "One seldom comes across a bride who changes her mind so abruptly." The crowd lingered in uneasy clusters about the churchyard, their Sunday finery now oddly out of place against the grimness of the scene. The once bright chatter of a village wedding had turned to low, tremulous murmurs, the sort that ripple through small communities like a chill through old bones. The vicar's voice could be heard faintly through the noise, urging calm, suggesting prayer, while constables from the next parish began ushering onlookers away with more irritation than authority. Miss Marple remained at the edge of the gathering, her delicate hands folded upon the handle of her umbrella. Her face, pale and calm beneath the soft brim of her hat, betrayed no emotion save a slight tightening around the eyes. The look of a woman remembering something from long ago and finding it oddly relevant now. She had seen sudden death before, of course, more times than she cared to count, and she knew too well how swiftly tragedy peeled back the polite veneer of village life to expose the rough human passions beneath. Inside the vestry, Dr. Haynes had finished his brief examination. "She died instantly," he said, wiping his spectacles with a kerchief. "No signs of a struggle that I can see, though it's a devilish position for a fall. Perhaps she stumbled on her train. The stones are uneven." Inspector Craddock, who had been called from Much Benham, frowned. A tall, patient man with an unfortunate habit of squinting when in thought, he seemed faintly uncomfortable in the genteel setting of St. Margaret's. "A fall," he repeated doubtfully. "But she was found lying nearly 6 feet from the step. That would take a fair tumble, Doctor." "Indeed," Haynes murmured, but his tone lacked conviction. Miss Marple, who had quietly drifted toward the vestry door, spoke for the first time. "I suppose," she said mildly, "that one might stumble while running. Though I do wonder why a bride would be running away from her own wedding." Both men turned to her. Craddock, recognizing her, straightened at once. "Miss Marple," he said with a half-smile. "I should have known you'd be here, though I can't imagine you've come for excitement." "Good heavens, no," she said. "I came for the cake, but now it seems the poor bride will have no appetite for it." Her tone was so mild, so unthreatening that Craddock merely sighed and turned back to his notes. Miss Marple, however, continued to observe with quiet precision. The body had been covered with a cloak. Beneath its edge, she could see the faint impression of a heel mark near the stone border. Smaller than the bride's own shoes, she thought, and angled oddly, as though someone had stood there only briefly, then stepped away. The groom, Harold Pennington, had been escorted into the vestry to sit down. He looked ghastly, not only pale, but bewildered, as though his mind could not quite reconcile the sequence of events. Miss Marple watched as he stared at the empty wedding bouquet upon the table, the petals damp and broken, a token of a future abruptly cancelled. "She was late dressing," he murmured to no one in particular. "Said she'd misplaced a locket. One her aunt gave her. I went to fetch Peter from the gate, and when I came back, she was gone." Craddock made a note of it. "The locket, was it valuable?" "Not especially," said Pennington. "Just sentimental. Gold with a portrait inside. Eliza was oddly attached to it." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "One does grow attached to certain things," she said, "especially if they serve as reminders of inconvenient memories." Craddock glanced at her, but said nothing. The constables began clearing the area in earnest now. Mrs. Pennington was being led away, still muttering in disbelief about that poor, silly girl. The villagers dispersed reluctantly, eager to tell the story afresh over tea, each one altering the details slightly to make themselves more central to the drama. By evening, Miss Trent's death would be discussed in every kitchen from here to Little Paddock, embroidered with speculation, until the truth was all but obscured. Later that afternoon, as the clouds gathered low and grey over the thatched rooftops, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage for tea with Reverend Lawrence and his sister, Mildred. The vicar, though well-meaning, was a man of limited imagination, and his notion of comfort in tragedy was a recitation of platitudes. Mildred, on the other hand, possessed that particular curiosity which so often masquerades as Christian concern. "Such a dreadful thing," Mildred said, pouring tea with a shaking hand. "To think she was to have been married only this morning, and such a handsome couple they made. Though I must say there was something—" Well, not quite straightforward about her. You know how one gets these impressions, Jane?" "Oh, indeed," said Miss Marple mildly. "One often notices such things, though of course one doesn't like to say so." "She was too perfect," Mildred went on, leaning forward. "Too polished, not like our local girls. And that cousin who came to stay with her, the dark one, I never liked the look of him. Always watching her, he was. Gave me the shivers." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Cousin," she said, without looking up. "Yes. Came down from London a few weeks ago. Said he was advising her on some family business. I believe his name was Mr. Archer. Seemed a bit too clever for comfort, if you ask me." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. "Family business," she murmured. Such an elastic phrase, isn't it? It can cover so many little complications. The vicar cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Now, Jane, we mustn't leap to conclusions. The poor girl's death was an accident. Dr. Haynes said as much." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet, dear Reverend, one must remember that people rarely die by accident in the middle of their own wedding." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece. That evening, as the lamps were lit along the high street and the pub began to fill with talk, Miss Marple sat by her window at the old vicarage and considered the day's events. The image of Eliza Trent's lifeless form among the roses would not leave her mind, nor would the expression she had seen on Harold Pennington's face. Not grief, precisely, but a kind of wounded astonishment. She thought of the missing locket, of the cousin from London, of the faint print by the garden wall, and she remembered another wedding, long ago, in another parish, where a bride had disappeared not because she feared marriage, but because she feared what her husband might discover. Outside, thunder rumbled distantly. Miss Marple reached for her notebook, a modest little thing bound in faded blue, and wrote a single line: "The bride who never left the church, but perhaps never meant to stay in it." Then she closed the book gently, extinguished her lamp, and sat for a moment in the dark, listening to the wind. Somewhere, she was certain, someone else was awake too. Someone who knew precisely why Eliza Trent would never again walk down the aisle. Morning came to St. Mary Mead shrouded in a mist that seemed reluctant to lift, as though the village itself wished to hide from what had happened the day before. The usual bustle of milk deliveries and post rounds was subdued. Even the sparrows outside the vicarage sang with a hesitant, uncertain note. In the corner cottage by the green, Miss Marple set her teapot upon the tray and opened her curtains just enough to see the narrow road glistening faintly with dew. The day would bring questions, she knew. Some answered, many not, but there was comfort in the quiet order of the morning ritual. She buttered her toast, fed her cat, and read the headline in the Morning Register. "Tragic death of bride. At St. Margaret's. Foul, play not ruled out." She could almost hear the whisper of excitement that headline would cause in every parlour. Death in St. Mary Mead was rarely ordinary, and never merely tragic. It was an event to be examined, discussed, and, unconsciously, relished. By 9 o'clock, the village was alive with rumour. Mrs. Bantry had told Mrs. Price Ridley that the bride's fiancé had been seen arguing with her the night before the wedding. The grocer's boy reported overhearing Constable Jarvis say there were 2 sets of footprints in the vestry garden, and old Mr. Harper, who fancied himself an expert on scandal, declared that Miss Trent wasn't who she said she was. Miss Marple listened to it all as she did her shopping, never correcting, never agreeing too eagerly. People talked freely to her, they always had. She gave the impression of mild distraction, the sort that made others confident she would never repeat a word. But she listened, and as she listened, a faint picture began to take shape in her mind, a pattern of behavior, of fears and desires that might explain why a woman would lie dead in her wedding dress. By noon, the mist had cleared enough for her to take the path toward the Pennington house. The police were there again, and she saw Inspector Craddock speaking to the maid at the gate. He nodded when he noticed her, half weary, half amused. "Ah, Miss Marple, come to offer your condolences, no doubt. I thought poor Harold might appreciate a friendly face," she said gently. "He looked so dreadfully alone yesterday." Craddock's sigh was almost a growl. "He's not in a fit state to talk to anyone, but I suppose you'll find a way. You usually do." Inside, the air felt stale, as though no one had dared open a window since the tragedy. Harold sat by the hearth, staring into the unlit grate. His hands were clasped tightly before him, white at the knuckles. When Miss Marple entered, he rose awkwardly, as though unsure what one said to an elderly lady after such an event. "My dear Mr. Pennington," she said softly, "please don't trouble yourself. I only came to see how you were managing. You mustn't think you're alone in this." He shook his head, struggling for composure. "I don't understand it, Miss Marple. Eliza wasn't ill. She wasn't unhappy. She was looking forward to the future." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, taking a seat. "And yet she was late that morning, wasn't she? Dressing alone in the vestry room? That must have been strange for a bride." He frowned. "She insisted on it. Said she wanted a moment to compose herself. I thought it was nerves. I never dreamed—" His voice broke and he turned away. "They say she fell, but I can't see how. She was careful, graceful, always aware of herself." "People often are," Miss Marple replied, "until something unexpected happens." He looked at her sharply, as though the word carried more weight than it should. After a moment, he said quietly, "The locket is gone. The one I told you about yesterday. I didn't mention it to the police, but I thought perhaps it was stolen." "Stolen?" Miss Marple's tone was soft, but probing. "How curious. Was it left behind in the vestry?" "No. I looked myself after they took her away. It wasn't there. She'd been wearing it that morning. I saw the chain when she tried on her veil." "Then someone removed it," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "After she fell, or after she was found." The implication hung in the air like the lingering scent of lilies. Harold Pennington swallowed hard, and Miss Marple rose. "I shan't keep you," she said gently, "but you must rest. The mind can play cruel tricks when it's exhausted." When she stepped back outside, Inspector Craddock was waiting near the gate. "You've a knack for talking to people," he remarked. "He won't say a word to me." "Oh, but I'm sure he will," Miss Marple said, "once he begins to think of Eliza as a person rather than a tragedy." Craddock gave her a sidelong glance. "You don't believe it was an accident?" "I believe," she said slowly, "that most accidents are the result of someone's intention, though not always the one you expect." He gave a short laugh. "That's not in any police manual, you know." "Then perhaps it should be," she said pleasantly. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Dr. Haynes. His surgery smelled faintly of camphor and pipe smoke, and he greeted her with an expression that blended fondness and mild irritation. "Ah, Miss Marple, you've come to tell me my profession again, have you?" "Not at all," she said, settling into the chair opposite his desk. "Only to inquire whether you found anything new about poor Miss Trent's condition." He hesitated. "Between ourselves," he said, lowering his voice, "I can't quite make sense of it. No bruises consistent with a heavy fall, no scrapes on the hands or knees. Yet her neck was broken cleanly, as though by a sharp twist." "Strange indeed," Miss Marple said. "And what of the footprints they mentioned?" He frowned. "Ah, you've heard. 2 sets, yes, one hers and one smaller, lighter, likely a woman's, but we've yet to identify to whom they belong." "Curious," she murmured. "A bride alone in the vestry, and another woman nearby. One wonders what they might have said to each other in those last minutes." Dr. Haynes looked up sharply. "You think she wasn't alone?" "Oh, I think very few people are ever truly alone," Miss Marple said mildly, even when they believe they are. By evening, word had reached the village that the cousin, Mr. Archer, had returned unexpectedly to his rooms at the Green Man Inn. He had been away since the morning of the wedding, claiming urgent business in London, but his sudden reappearance caused a ripple of speculation that even Miss Marple found difficult to ignore. She decided to take her usual evening walk in that direction, a habit so well established that no one would think it odd. The Green Man stood at the far end of the village, its windows glowing warmly through the dusk. She entered with her customary nod to the innkeeper, who greeted her as though she were part of the furniture. Mr. Archer was seated in a corner by the fire, a dark, brooding figure with a kind of charm that seemed always half-forced. When she approached, he rose politely, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of irritation. "Mr. Archer," she said, her voice all sweetness, "I was so sorry to hear about your cousin. Such a dreadful thing. You must be quite beside yourself." He inclined his head stiffly. "Yes, it's shocking. I came back as soon as I heard." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "And how curious that you should have been away just then. So inconvenient, funerals and inquiries and all that." His gaze sharpened. "Are you implying something, madam?" "Oh, dear me, no," she said, smiling. "Only that timing can be such a treacherous thing. One never knows when tragedy will choose to arrive." For a long moment they held each other's eyes. Then Mr. Archer smiled, thinly, without warmth. "Quite," he said. "And sometimes it arrives right on schedule." Miss Marple inclined her head as though in agreement and withdrew. Outside, the air had grown colder, and the first stars pricked faintly through the lingering clouds. She paused on the path home, her mind turning over that last sentence. There had been no grief in his tone, no bewilderment, only certainty. And certainty, she reflected, was a most dangerous thing for a man to possess when murder had been done. The next morning brought rain, a thin, steady drizzle that blurred the edges of the world and turned the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead into winding ribbons of silver. To Miss Marple, sitting by her lace-curtained window with a steaming cup of tea, the weather seemed entirely appropriate. It matched the uncertainty that had settled over the village, the quiet unease that clung to every whispered conversation. Death had a way of altering even the air one breathed. People spoke in softer tones as though afraid the dead might overhear them. She watched as Inspector Craddock's motor car splashed to a halt near the church. He had returned early, which suggested the investigation was moving quickly, or not at all. She suspected the latter. A case of this sort rarely followed a straight path. Human motives seldom did. A few minutes later, she saw the inspector make his way up the path to the vicarage. When he knocked at her door shortly afterward, she was already prepared with 2 cups and a plate of currant scones. "I oughtn't to trouble you," Craddock said, shrugging off his damp coat. "But I thought I'd pick your brain. Between ourselves, the business grows odder by the hour." Miss Marple gestured for him to sit. "You know, Inspector, my brain is very ordinary. It's only that I've had more time to observe people being foolish." He smiled faintly. "Then you'll understand why I'm confounded. We've confirmed the cousin, Mr. Archer, was in London the night before the wedding. Took the morning train back yesterday. That clears him, unless he's mastered the art of being in 2 places at once." "Has he, indeed?" Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "But London is so large and accommodating. One might take a late train quite unnoticed if one wished to do so." Craddock sighed. "The landlord swears he didn't return till after 9 in the evening. And yet, he's too composed, too certain of himself. When I questioned him this morning, he admitted to knowing about the missing locket before we did." Miss Marple looked up. "How extraordinary. Did he explain how?" "He claimed Eliza mentioned it in a letter she wrote the night before. Said she'd misplaced it and was dreadfully cross with herself. We found no such letter, of course." Miss Marple set her cup down gently. "Letters are such fragile things, Inspector. They have an unfortunate habit of being found, or not found, according to who most needs them. Craddock regarded her with the half-skeptical, half-respectful look of a man who had learned not to dismiss her words too quickly. "You think someone destroyed it?" "I think," she said softly, "that if Miss Trent did write a letter, it was not about a trinket, and if she did not, then someone has gone to a good deal of trouble to make us believe she did." He tapped his pen against his notebook, then leaned back. "There's something else. The maid who helped dress the bride swears she heard voices in the vestry just before the ceremony, 2 women arguing. She assumed it was nerves, didn't think to mention it until this morning." Miss Marple's eyes brightened a little. 2 women? How very curious. Did she recognize the other voice? No. Said it was unfamiliar, soft but angry. You know how village talk is. We'll have half the women in St. Mary Mead swearing it was theirs by evening. "Quite," Miss Marple agreed, smiling faintly. "And yet anger has a particular quality, doesn't it? It sounds different when it comes from love, from jealousy, or from fear. If only we could ask her which kind it was." Craddock chuckled dryly. "You'd have made a fine detective, Miss Marple." "Oh, my dear Inspector, I'm far too old to chase villains," she said, her blue eyes glinting. "But I do know something about women and secrets. They are often rather the same thing." After he left, Miss Marple sat a long while in silence, her mind gently turning over the fragments of the puzzle like pebbles in a stream. The missing locket, the mysterious second woman, the cousin's too convenient alibi. None of these things fit comfortably within the pattern of an accident. And then there was the matter of motive, always the most elusive thread. Who, among those gathered for a wedding, would wish the bride dead? She rose, fetched her shawl, and set out for the church. The drizzle had become a soft mist by then, curling around the gravestones like smoke. The vestry door stood ajar, its paint peeling slightly, and inside the air smelled faintly of lilies and candle wax. Miss Marple knelt by the flagstones where Eliza Trent had fallen. There was no visible trace now, no blood, no mark save a faint impression of mud near the garden wall. But Miss Marple saw more than most. She saw, in the disarray of the small room, the marks of haste and interruption. A ribbon fallen beneath a chair, a half-used handkerchief dropped beside the dressing screen, and, by the window, a tiny scrap of fabric caught on the latch. She examined it carefully. Pale green silk, delicate, expensive. Not from the bride's gown, which had been white satin. Miss Marple tucked it neatly into her handkerchief case, her expression thoughtful. As she stepped outside, she noticed Mrs. Bantry approaching from the path, her umbrella held like a weapon against the rain. "Oh, Jane, I thought I might find you here," she called, lowering her voice as she neared. "They're saying the poor girl had enemies, can you imagine? In a place like this." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Enemies are like weeds, my dear. They turn up everywhere, even in the best-kept gardens." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Well, if you ask me, that cousin of hers is a wrong 'un. But between ourselves, I've just heard something far more shocking. The maid, Mary Hobbs, the one who helped her dress, was dismissed this morning. The vicar's sister said she was too emotional." "How very prompt," Miss Marple said. "And where did Mary go?" "To her mother's cottage on Mill Lane, I believe." Poor girl was in tears. "Then perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "she might welcome a visitor who listens more than she talks." An hour later, she found Mary Hobbs sitting by a small fire, her eyes red and swollen. She started when Miss Marple appeared, then relaxed a little at the sight of the kindly old lady. "I'm so sorry, miss," she said. "I shouldn't be talking about it, but it's been dreadful. I can't sleep for thinking of her, lying there so still." "Quite natural, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "You were with her near the end, weren't you? You heard her voice?" Mary nodded, twisting her apron. "She was upset, miss. Crying, though she tried to hide it. Said she didn't want to go through with it, that she couldn't." And then another voice. Cold. Sharp. told her she had no choice. "I was just outside the door. I didn't dare go in." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did you recognize the other voice?" Mary hesitated. "I thought I did for a moment. It sounded like Mrs. Pennington, the groom's mother." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her knitting needles, resting in her lap, stilled completely. "Are you certain?" Mary's eyes filled again. "I can't swear to it, miss, but I'd know that tone anywhere, like someone used to being obeyed." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "You've done just right to tell me, my dear. Sometimes the truth needs to find the quietest path before it's ready to be heard." When she left the cottage, dusk was falling again, and the rain had eased into a faint, silvery drizzle. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind alive with connections. Mrs. Pennington, a mother proud, controlling, perhaps desperate to keep some secret buried, a bride reluctant to marry, a missing locket that might have held more than a portrait. She paused at her gate, looking toward the faint light in the direction of the Pennington home. "No choice," she murmured, recalling the maid's words. "And yet there is always a choice, especially for those who would rather kill than lose control." The rain pattered softly on her umbrella as she went inside. In the quiet of her parlor, she set the scrap of green silk upon the table and studied it under the lamplight. Then, with a small sigh, she opened her notebook and wrote another line beneath her previous one. The second woman. Green silk. A mother's voice. One that commands rather than comforts. She closed the book and sat back, her eyes distant as though listening for the faint echo of footsteps on wet stone. Somewhere, she thought, someone was growing uneasy. And that, she knew, was always the first sign that the truth was near. The following morning dawned clear, as though the rain had washed the village clean of its unease. But the clarity of the air only seemed to throw into sharper relief the tension that still lingered, unspoken yet felt, among the inhabitants of St. Mary Mead. In every shop and parlor, whispers persisted about the locket, the cousin, the mother-in-law, the argument in the vestry. Each retelling grew a little more elaborate, each voice a touch more certain. Yet amid all the noise, Miss Marple knew. The truth was likely to be found, not in what was said, but in what had been carefully left unsaid. She rose early, tied her hat neatly under her chin, and walked to the post office. Her purpose was ostensibly to purchase stamps, but she lingered longer than necessary. Miss Hartnell, who ran the counter, could always be relied upon for the latest tidbits. And sure enough, as Miss Marple counted out her coins, Miss Hartnell leaned forward with the air of one who carries valuable intelligence. "Did you hear, Miss Marple?" she whispered. "Mrs. Pennington's gone quite to pieces. The doctor's been twice this morning, and between us, I think she's hiding something. Always was a proud one, never spoke a kind word about the bride. Said she was too modern, too independent, whatever that means." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "A very trying time for her, I'm sure. One forgets that grief can take many forms." Miss Hartnell sniffed. "Grief, yes, or guilt. I'll tell you this, Jane. If I were the police, I'd have a good look inside that woman's sitting room. She's been sending for the parlor maid to fetch parcels from her husband's old study. What she wants with his papers now, heaven only knows." Miss Marple smiled politely, bought her stamps, and departed without comment. But her mind was busy. Papers being moved, parcels being hidden. Such details seldom meant nothing. She decided that a visit to Mrs. Pennington was long overdue. By midday, she stood before the Pennington house once more, her expression that of a kindly spinster paying a call of sympathy. The maid, clearly nervous, ushered her into the drawing-room where Mrs. Pennington sat rigidly upright on the sofa. Her face, once sharp and commanding, now bore the drawn, brittle look of a woman held together by sheer force of will. "Miss Marple," she said stiffly, "I suppose you've come to offer condolences, or to satisfy curiosity like the rest of them. "My dear Mrs. Pennington," Miss Marple said, taking a seat opposite, "I never indulge in curiosity for its own sake. I merely find it instructive when things don't quite align as they ought." The older woman's eyes narrowed. "And what, may I ask, do you believe is misaligned?" Miss Marple folded her gloved hands serenely. "Oh, very little. Only that Eliza Trent seemed to have everything a young woman could wish for: a good match, a fine home, a handsome husband-to-be. And yet she hesitated. That sort of hesitation usually has its roots in fear, not doubt. I wonder, Mrs. Pennington, was she afraid of something?" For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Then Mrs. Pennington rose abruptly, crossing to the window. "Afraid," she repeated, her voice tight. "Nonsense. Eliza was impulsive, spoiled. She wanted everything to be her own way. Harold would have been good for her, steady, sensible. But she was not the kind of girl to value that." "Indeed," Miss Marple said quietly. "And yet I imagine she valued her independence very highly." Mrs. Pennington turned sharply. "What are you implying?" "Nothing at all, dear lady," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild. "Only that independence, once threatened, can make people do desperate things, especially when they believe they are acting out of love." The words hung there, delicate but pointed. Mrs. Pennington's lips trembled slightly. Then, as if mastering herself, she said briskly, "You've quite misunderstood me, Miss Marple. My only concern was my son's happiness, nothing more." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course, a mother's love can be a most powerful force. Sometimes I think too powerful." When she left the Pennington house, she found Inspector Craddock waiting near the gate. His face was grave. "You were right about the locket," he said without preamble. "We found it this morning." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Indeed? Where?" "In a hedgerow, 1/2 mile from the church. It must have been thrown there. Broken clasp, no portrait inside, just a folded scrap of paper." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "And what did the paper say?" Craddock handed her a small notebook. "Copied it down myself. It reads, 'I can't go through with it. Forgive me. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Signed, Eliza.'" Miss Marple read the line twice before handing it back. "How very convenient," she said softly. "A confession of despair, neatly timed to absolve others of blame. You think it's a forgery?" "I think," she said thoughtfully, "that Eliza Trent was many things, but not a coward, and certainly not the sort to leave her own handwriting lying about to serve another's purpose." Craddock frowned. Her cousin swore the note looked genuine. "Claims it matches her style exactly." "Her cousin," Miss Marple repeated, her tone faintly amused. "Mr. Archer seems to know a good deal for a man who claims to have been elsewhere." Craddock looked weary. "I've spoken to him again. He insists he last saw her the night before the wedding. Says she mentioned being troubled, but wouldn't explain why." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That sounds like something a liar would say. Truth wrapped in just enough falsehood to sound respectable. Tell me, Inspector, did Mr. Archer seem nervous?" He shook his head. "Not nervous. Smug." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "That's worse." They walked a short distance together before she stopped. "Inspector, may I ask a small favor? Could you find out whether Mrs. Pennington ever employed a dressmaker in London? Someone who might have made her gowns?" Craddock blinked. "Her gowns?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I happen to recall a rather pretty scrap of green silk, the sort of material a woman of taste might have ordered from a fashionable shop, not something our local seamstresses would stock." He studied her face, trying to read the unspoken thought there, but Miss Marple only smiled and bade him good day. That evening, as dusk settled and the first chill of autumn crept into the air, she sat by her fire, knitting in slow, deliberate rhythm. Each click of the needles marked a thought forming, a connection made. She thought of Mrs. Pennington's trembling hands, of Mr. Archer's poised indifference, of a frightened young bride cornered in the vestry by someone she trusted. And she thought of that faint voice, angry yet afraid, which the maid had overheard. Somewhere in the pattern, a thread had begun to loosen. It would only take one small tug to unravel the rest. At 9:30, there was a knock at her door. It was Dr. Haynes, his face grave. "Miss Marple," he said, "I thought you should know. Mrs. Pennington's had a turn. Nothing fatal, thank heavens, but she was found unconscious by her desk. They say she'd been burning papers." Miss Marple set her knitting down slowly. "Burning papers, you say? Oh, dear me. How very reckless of her. One should always be careful with fire, especially when the truth smoulders so close beneath the surface." Dr. Haynes looked puzzled. "You think she meant to destroy evidence?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that guilt has many forms, and fear burns faster than paper ever could." When he left, she rose and crossed to her writing desk. From the drawer, she took the scrap of green silk and laid it beside a small clipping she had saved from last year's Lady's Companion. It was an advertisement for a London dressmaker. Pennington and Archer, exclusive designs, Mayfair. Her eyes softened with a kind of sad certainty. "So that's the connection," she murmured. "Blood and business, pride and deceit, all stitched together with silk." The fire crackled in the grate as she sat back, her gaze distant but sure. The pattern, at last, was beginning to reveal its shape. The next day dawned grey and still, a peculiar hush lying over St. Mary Mead as though the village itself were holding its breath. The scent of wood smoke drifted from chimneys, mingling with the faint tang of autumn decay. In the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, solemn and steady, reminding everyone that life, for all its tragedies, continued with indifferent rhythm. Miss Marple, however, sat at her writing table, her thoughts far from ordinary routine. Before her lay the advertisement from Lady's Companion and the green silk scrap, both arranged with almost reverential precision. She had been awake much of the night, thinking about the locket, the forged letter, and now the startling revelation of the Pennington and Archer dressmaking firm. Connections, once elusive, were beginning to form a distinct shape, though one thread still eluded her. Motive. She was pondering this when a firm knock startled her from her thoughts. Inspector Craddock entered, his face serious, but not without a hint of grim satisfaction. "Morning, Miss Marple. I've been looking for you. Thought you'd like to know we've identified the fabric." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. Then we are thinking along the same lines. "Do tell." "It's from a gown Mrs. Pennington had ordered in London last month," Craddock said. "The shop's records confirm it. Same shade, same weave. Apparently she'd had the dress altered here by a local seamstress, Mrs. Finch." Miss Marple smiled faintly. How convenient that fashion should so often lend itself to crime. "And Mrs. Finch?" "She remembers the material," Craddock said, flipping open his notebook. "Says Mrs. Pennington brought it in for last-minute adjustments 2 days before the wedding. The odd thing is, she seemed in quite a hurry and insisted on taking the trimmings herself instead of leaving them behind. Women don't usually bother with scraps, do they?" "Only when they've reason to," Miss Marple murmured. "And what of the cousin, Mr. Archer? Have you spoken with him again?" Craddock grimaced. "He's gone. Checked out of the Green Man early this morning, left no forwarding address. The innkeeper says he was in a state, though what that means I'll leave to interpretation." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she resumed her work, though her thoughts were far from the pattern before her. "Mr. Archer's sudden departure suggests one of 2 things," she said. "Either he fears discovery or believes his work here is complete." Craddock leaned against the mantel, watching her. "And which do you believe?" "Oh," she said mildly. "That depends on what exactly his work was." The inspector gave a low whistle. You think he and Mrs. Pennington were in this together? I think, Miss Marple replied gently, that blood and money make very untidy bedfellows. You see, Inspector, business partnerships, especially between relatives, can be rather more intimate than most marriages. Resentments fester, betrayals multiply, and sometimes, when one partner fears being ruined by the other, the solution seems painfully simple. Craddock straightened. You're saying Eliza Trent found something out? Miss Marple nodded. Something she wasn't meant to know. Perhaps about the Pennington and Archer firm. Perhaps about financial impropriety. It's so often money in the end. Money and pride. Craddock frowned. But why marry Harold then? Why not leave quietly? Miss Marple's voice softened. Because she loved him, or thought she did. And she may have believed that marrying him could protect her from whatever storm was brewing between his mother and his cousin. When she realized it wouldn't, that the danger was greater than she'd thought, she tried to call it off. That, I think, was her fatal mistake. Craddock's pen stilled over his notebook. Then you're saying the argument the maid overheard was not between Eliza and her own conscience, Miss Marple finished, but between Eliza and Mrs. Pennington. The mother's pride, the family's reputation, the business, all would be imperiled if the girl spoke. Mrs. Pennington would have done anything to silence her. There was silence for a moment, broken only by the faint creak of the clock. Then Craddock said quietly, "But she's not the sort to strangle someone." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "She isn't. Not directly. But she might have been the sort to confront Eliza, to threaten or frighten her. And fear, Inspector, can be as deadly as any weapon when combined with a steep step and a moment's desperation." Craddock nodded slowly. "And Archer?" Miss Marple smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Ah, Mr. Archer, the calculating type. I dare say he arrived in time to tidy things up, to make it appear a tragic fall. Perhaps even to ensure that the incriminating locket disappeared." Craddock snapped his notebook shut. "That fits the timeline all right. If we can prove he forged that note, we've got him." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "You won't prove it by handwriting, Inspector. He's clever enough to disguise it, but there's something far more telling than handwriting." "What's that?" "The tone," she said simply. "A forged note always says too much, or too little. A real farewell would contain sorrow, regret. Eliza's supposed note, however, contains neither. It reads like a performance, one designed for the eyes of guilt." Craddock exhaled slowly, an admiring smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You really do think of everything, don't you?" Miss Marple gave a small, dismissive wave of her hand. "I think of people, Inspector. They are far more interesting than evidence." After he left, she went for a walk through the village. The sun had broken weakly through the clouds, glinting on wet leaves and puddles. As she passed the church, she paused at the vestry garden once more. The air was quiet now, but there was a heaviness in it, a kind of echo. She crouched by the stone path, running her fingers lightly over the uneven surface. A small groove caught her attention, a tiny indentation along the edge of the step. Something sharp had scraped there, perhaps in haste. A heel, yes, but not a woman's. A man's boot. She stood slowly, gazing toward the wall. The moss was disturbed again, faintly, as though someone had come and gone since the rain. The realization struck her with quiet certainty. Archer had been here last night, likely searching for something he'd lost, or something someone else had hidden. She walked home with measured steps, her thoughts focused, her expression unreadable. At her gate, she met Reverend Lawrence, his kindly face creased with concern. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, "they tell me Mrs. Pennington is recovering. Quite shaken, of course. I hope you'll call on her again. A woman in distress needs spiritual guidance." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed she does, Reverend. Though I dare say what she needs most is truth." That evening, as the first stars appeared, Miss Marple sat again at her desk, her pen poised above her notebook. She wrote slowly, her neat hand precise and even. The mother's silk, the cousin's haste, the bride's fear. The link is money, pride, and a secret bound by blood. But guilt, like silk, frays easily when pulled. She closed the notebook and sat back, gazing into the fire. There was still one piece missing, one human element that would make the entire pattern complete. Somewhere, hidden among the polite facades and whispered grief, was the person who knew exactly how Eliza Trent had died. The clock struck 9. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the window. Outside, the village lay still under a thin crescent moon, and somewhere beyond the hedgerows she sensed movement, a shadow slipping past the churchyard gate, quiet and deliberate. Her expression did not change, but her hands folded together in calm resolution. "Ah," she whispered to the empty room. "So the guilty grow restless at last. That's always when the truth begins to walk abroad." The next morning came with a damp, heavy stillness, the kind that seems to muffle sound and weigh upon thought. The mist had crept back into the lanes of St. Mary Mead, and though the sun was trying bravely to pierce it, the world remained subdued, expectant, as though the village knew that something was about to break. Miss Marple, however, was already awake, her fire burning low and steady as she finished a letter to her nephew Raymond in London, though her mind was far from its contents. Her eyes lingered on the final line she had written before sealing it. People so rarely conceal what they think. They only conceal why they think it. There came a light tapping on the door. When she opened it, she found Inspector Craddock standing there again, looking weary but purposeful. His coat was flecked with moisture, his hat pushed slightly askew, and in his hand he held a crumpled envelope. "You won't thank me for waking you so early," he said, "but I think this may interest you. We've just had word from London." Miss Marple stepped aside to let him in, gesturing toward the armchair by the fire. "The best discoveries always arrive with the morning post," she said mildly. Craddock unfolded the paper. "You were right about the business, Miss Marple. The Pennington and Archer firm wasn't quite what it seemed. Our contact in London found records of financial irregularities, substantial ones. It appears Mr. Archer was diverting money through false accounts, and Mrs. Pennington, bless her, was either complicit or blind to it. But here's the curious part. Eliza Trent was employed there for a short while last year before she came to St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple's knitting paused in mid-air. "Was she indeed? Oh, my dear Inspector, that does explain so very much." Craddock frowned. "It explains her connection to Archer, certainly, but not why she'd keep it quiet, nor why she'd turn up here and get herself engaged to his cousin." "Oh, but it does," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes distant, seeing not the room before her, but the small, intricate web of human folly that had been slowly revealing itself. "It explains everything, if one thinks as women do. You see, Inspector, a girl like Eliza would have seen things in that firm that were not meant for her eyes, accounts that didn't balance, clients who didn't exist. Perhaps she even confronted Mr. Archer about them. He, being clever and vain, may have tried to charm her into silence, but she was not the sort to be deceived twice. She left London, determined to start anew, and fate, or perhaps irony, placed her in the path of Harold Pennington." Craddock whistled low. "So she fell in love with the son of her employer's partner." "Exactly," Miss Marple replied. "And when Mrs. Pennington discovered who she really was, she must have realized the danger. Eliza knew too much about Archer's deceit, and perhaps about her own part in it. Marriage would have made her knowledge all the more dangerous." Craddock rubbed his temple. "And the confrontation happened that morning?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but I don't think Mrs. Pennington meant to kill her. She likely meant only to frighten her, to make her reconsider the wedding, perhaps even to threaten exposure. But emotions, once unleashed, are difficult to contain. I suspect Eliza turned to leave, and in that moment of anger, she fell. Craddock finished grimly. Precisely. A tragic mixture of fear and pride, Miss Marple said. And then, later, Archer arrived. He would have found the scene, realized what had happened, and acted swiftly. He removed the locket, forged the note, and made the death look deliberate. A man like him would never risk scandal. Better a supposed suicide than a trial. Craddock stared into the fire, the faint crackle of the logs filling the silence. "It fits," he said finally. "Too neatly, perhaps. But it fits. There's only one thing I can't understand. Why burn the papers? Mrs. Pennington must have known that would draw suspicion." Miss Marple looked at him with the faintest hint of pity. "Because, Inspector, she thought guilt could be destroyed as easily as paper. People who've lived behind appearances all their lives find it very hard to stop performing, even in despair." Craddock rose slowly. "We'll need her statement. She's still weak, but I'll arrange for questioning this afternoon. If she admits even a part of it, we can issue a warrant for Archer." Miss Marple nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. "Be careful, Inspector. Desperate people often surprise us with what they're still capable of." When he had gone, she sat a long while without moving, her gaze fixed upon the small brass clock on the mantel. The hands crept forward with quiet precision. She was waiting, though for what, she could not have said. There was an uneasiness she couldn't quite name, a sense that something still hovered unseen just beyond the edge of comprehension. By noon, she decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Pennington herself. The house was quiet, the curtains drawn against the pale light. A faint smell of smoke still lingered, acrid and unnatural. The maid admitted her reluctantly, whispering that her mistress was resting, but Miss Marple had a way of moving past objections without appearing to do so. Within moments, she was at the threshold of the sitting room. Mrs. Pennington sat in a chair near the hearth, pale but composed. Her hands lay clasped on her lap too tightly, and her eyes, once sharp and cold, had the hollow gleam of someone haunted by their own reflections. "Miss Marple," she said faintly, "I suppose you've come to see the spectacle, the proud woman brought low." Miss Marple shook her head. "No spectacle, my dear, only pity. Pride is such a heavy burden to carry. It crushes more lives than malice ever does." Mrs. Pennington gave a brittle laugh. "Pity, how generous. But you don't know what it is to see everything you've built threatened by a foolish girl's defiance. My husband's name, my son's future, ruined because she couldn't keep silent." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "So you did confront her?" The woman's shoulders stiffened. "Yes. I told her she would destroy us all. I said she had no right to marry into our family if she meant to shame it. She tried to go, and I—" Her voice broke. "She slipped. I swear she slipped. I didn't touch her." "I believe you," Miss Marple said quietly. "But you must tell the inspector everything. If you don't, Mr. Archer will make certain you bear the blame alone." Mrs. Pennington's head jerked up, her eyes narrowing. "Archer? He's gone back to London." Miss Marple leaned forward. "So you think. But last night he was here, in the churchyard. I saw the moss disturbed. He came back for something. Perhaps a paper, perhaps to ensure no trace of his forgery remained. He will not rest until all evidence of his part in this affair is gone." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Mrs. Pennington whispered, "There was another letter. Eliza wrote it to Harold, not to Archer. I took it from her dressing table before the ceremony. It's in my desk. She said she'd discovered something dreadful that she meant to tell Harold after the wedding." "Then you must give that letter to the inspector at once," Miss Marple said gently. "It is your only chance at peace." Mrs. Pennington nodded faintly, tears glinting at the corners of her eyes. "You're very shrewd, Miss Marple. You see everything, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled sadly. "Not everything, my dear. Only what people hide too carelessly." When she left the house, the air outside felt colder, sharper, as if the truth itself had shifted something in the weather. She walked slowly toward the lane, her thoughts heavy. The letter would confirm all she suspected, perhaps even expose Archer's precise role. But something still gnawed at her, something she could not yet name. A faint unease, like a thread left loose in a tapestry. As she turned the corner near the churchyard, she paused. A figure stood by the gate, tall, dark-coated, unmoving. Even through the mist, she recognized the posture, the stillness of a man watching. "Mr. Archer." For a moment, neither moved. Then he inclined his head slightly, a polite gesture that felt like a threat. Miss Marple did not flinch. She merely adjusted her shawl, met his gaze, and continued past him, her steps measured, unhurried. But her thoughts were clear as glass. The game, she knew, was not yet over, and somewhere in the quiet heart of St. Mary Mead, the final move was already waiting to be made. Miss Marple walked home with deliberate calm, though her heart beat rather faster than usual. Mr. Archer's sudden reappearance at the churchyard had confirmed every suspicion she harbored, and yet there had been something else in his demeanor, an unsettling composure, as though he no longer feared discovery. That, to Miss Marple, was never a good sign. A cornered man grows nervous, but a confident one has already laid his next move. When she reached her gate, she paused to glance behind her. The lane was empty, the mist rising now in pale tendrils that caught the faint orange of the afternoon sun. Still, she could not shake the sense that someone was watching. Inside, she lit the fire and sat for a long while in her chair, her hands folded on her lap, her mind running like a quiet machine. Every piece of the puzzle was nearly in place, the motive, the opportunity, the chain of concealment, but one small thing remained unclear. Why had Archer risked returning at all? If his plan had succeeded, he ought to have left the village far behind. Instead, he lingered. Either he was retrieving something of value, or ensuring something remained hidden. It was the latter possibility that troubled her most. As she considered this, the doorbell rang sharply. It was Inspector Craddock again, his face set in grim lines. "We've had a development," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Pennington's dead." Miss Marple rose slowly. "Dead? How?" "Poison," Craddock said. "Dr. Haynes found her barely half an hour after you left. The maid swears she'd taken her usual tea. He thinks it was digitalis. Same bottle she's had for years. A few drops too many." Miss Marple's voice was steady, but her eyes darkened. "And the letter? The one she told me about?" "Gone," Craddock said. "No sign of it anywhere. Her desk was ransacked. Whoever killed her took it." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Then it's as I feared. She tried to make amends, and it cost her life." Craddock's jaw tightened. "Archer, it has to be. He knew she'd break sooner or later. But there's nothing to tie him directly to the scene. No witnesses, no prints, nothing but the opportunity, and half the village could have had that." "Oh, Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "you mustn't look for evidence as though it were a coin on the pavement. The truth doesn't always leave fingerprints. But people always leave traces of themselves in what they do. I dare say Mr. Archer will leave more than he intends." Craddock sighed. "We've sent a man to London to check his address again. He won't get far. I'll stake my badge on it." "Then I should advise you," said Miss Marple, "to keep an eye on the churchyard tonight. If I'm not mistaken, our friend Mr. Archer will return there once more before the night is through." Craddock frowned. "What for?" "To finish what he started," Miss Marple said simply. "There's something he still needs to recover or destroy. He won't rest until it's done." Craddock looked at her curiously, but there was something in her tone that discouraged argument. "Very well," he said finally. "I'll have men stationed near the gate from dusk onward, and if you see anything unusual, Miss Marple, I beg you, don't go near it. Leave that to us." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, I'm far too old to chase villains through the fog. But if I happen to notice anything, I'll be sure to let you know." When he had gone, she stood by the window, watching the light fade from the sky. The village below grew dim and muted, chimneys breathing thin ribbons of smoke into the cooling air. She could see the faint silhouette of the church spire against the deepening grey, and somewhere beyond it, the shadow of the churchyard wall. It was all so quiet, so deceptively peaceful. She did not move for nearly an hour. Then, as darkness began to gather, she took her shawl from the peg, wrapped it tightly about her shoulders, and slipped out into the night. The path was damp underfoot, the mist returning heavier now, coiling low among the gravestones. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves and the distant cry of an owl. Miss Marple's footsteps were light, almost soundless, as she made her way toward the vestry garden. The air smelled faintly of earth and moss, sharp with the cold tang of stone. She paused near the gate, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. And then she saw him. A dark figure, crouched by the wall, his face turned away, the glow of a small lantern illuminating his hands as they worked hurriedly at the base of the old stone. She could hear the faint scrape of metal against rock. He was digging. Miss Marple watched in silence, her pulse steady. The figure, Archer, there could be no doubt, unearthed something wrapped in oilcloth, shook off the dirt, and tucked it quickly into his coat. Then he rose and turned sharply, and for the briefest instant, his eyes met hers. They stood there, two silhouettes in the mist, the distance between them filled with tension as fine and taut as thread. Archer's face was expressionless, but his voice, when he spoke, was low and controlled. "You should not be here, Miss Marple." "Nor should you, Mr. Archer," she replied evenly. "The dead deserve peace, don't you think?" He smiled faintly, though his eyes were hard. "Peace is for the innocent, Miss Marple, and innocence, as you must know by now, is a rare thing." "Indeed," she said softly, "though guilt, I find, is rarely as clever as it believes itself to be." He took a step closer. "You've been meddling. You think you understand this business, but you don't. Eliza's death was an accident, an unfortunate one. And Mrs. Pennington's, well, she couldn't live with her conscience. That's all there is to it." "Oh, but that isn't all, is it?" Miss Marple said gently. "You see, Mr. Archer, you've made one very small mistake. You've gone to a great deal of trouble to retrieve something from that wall. I imagine it's the real letter, the one Eliza wrote to Harold. The forgery was convenient, but the truth would have ruined you, and when Mrs. Pennington tried to reveal it, you silenced her." His eyes flickered. "You have quite an imagination for an old woman." "Age, Mr. Archer, brings a certain clarity," she said. "One learns to see what others prefer not to. For instance, that you are not the sort of man to dig up a grave unless you've something to hide." He stepped closer still, his tone turning colder. "I think, Miss Marple, that you've seen more than is wise." Miss Marple's voice did not waver. "And I think you've already lost more than you realize. Inspector Craddock has men posted just beyond that gate. I imagine they've been listening quite attentively for some time now." For the first time, Archer's composure cracked. His head turned sharply toward the lane, and in that instant, a voice rang out, "That's far enough, Archer." Flashlights cut through the mist. Two constables emerged from the darkness, revolvers drawn. Archer froze, his face pale in the sudden glare. For a moment, he looked as though he might run, but then his shoulders sagged, and he dropped the bundle at his feet. The oilcloth tore open, revealing a single folded letter. Its edges yellowed, the ink faded, but unmistakably written in Eliza Trent's hand. As Craddock approached, Miss Marple stepped back, her expression unreadable. Archer was led away without struggle, though his eyes, when they met hers once more, burned with silent fury. Later, when the churchyard had emptied and the mist began to lift, Craddock turned to Miss Marple, the letter in his hand. You were right again. It's all here. Proof of the fraud, the threats, even a warning to Harold. She'd planned to expose them both after the wedding. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Poor child. She tried to free herself, but in doing so she sealed her fate. And yet she's had her justice in the end. Craddock exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know how you do it, Miss Marple. I really don't. She smiled faintly, gazing toward the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. Oh, my dear Inspector, it's really quite simple. One only has to watch how people behave when they believe no one is looking. The rest, she said, turning toward the quiet path home, is merely human nature. The following morning broke clear and gold, the first truly bright day since the tragedy had begun. The mist that had haunted St. Mary Mead was gone, swept aside by a brisk wind that carried with it the faint scent of wood smoke and roses. The church bell tolled for early service, and though its tone was the same as ever, something in the village had shifted. The gossip, so fevered these past days, now carried an air of exhaustion, half relief, half guilt. Justice, it seemed, had been done. Mr. Archer had been arrested, Mrs. Pennington was dead, and the affair was over. Or so everyone said. Miss Marple, however, did not share their certainty. She sat at her breakfast table, the newspaper folded beside her, her tea cooling unnoticed. The official report was concise, almost sterile. A conclusion has been reached in the St. Mary Mead wedding tragedy. Evidence recovered by the authorities indicates that Eliza Trent's death was accidental, but subsequent events reveal that Charles Archer, her cousin by marriage, engaged in fraud and forgery to conceal financial crimes. He is now in custody. It was a neat, tidy ending. Too tidy, in her opinion. She had seen such endings before, the kind that comforted the public but left the truth dangling like an untrimmed thread. And Miss Marple, for all her politeness, had never been one to leave threads untied. Something still troubled her deeply, not the question of guilt, for she was certain Archer bore it, but the question of how things had truly come to pass. His actions were those of a man covering another's crime, yes, but also of one seeking control. There was, beneath the surface of his arrogance, a trace of fear, and fear always pointed to a secret larger than pride. She was still thinking when Inspector Craddock arrived, his expression weary but satisfied. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. "I wanted to thank you personally, Miss Marple. Without your sharp eyes, Archer might have slipped away entirely. We've got him locked up now, and with that letter as evidence, the Crown will have no trouble making a case." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm glad to hear it, Inspector. And yet, you don't seem entirely content yourself." He hesitated, then gave a rueful laugh. "You know me too well. It's Mrs. Pennington. The coroner's report came in this morning. Digitalis, yes, but in a dosage that doesn't quite make sense. It wasn't enough to kill instantly, but she died within minutes, almost as if something accelerated it." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Accelerated?" He nodded. "The doctor thinks it might have been mixed with another substance. Wine, perhaps, but there's no trace of a glass or bottle in her room. If Archer poisoned her, he did it with remarkable precision. But I can't see how. He'd left the house before she drank her tea. The maid swears she poured it herself." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. "Did she, indeed? And what of the sugar?" Craddock blinked. "The sugar? I hadn't thought to ask." Miss Marple rose, her expression distant, thoughtful. "Oh, my dear Inspector, poison rarely travels the path one expects. People think in straight lines, drink this, eat that, but murder, you see, is almost always diagonal." Craddock groaned. "You'll have me drawing diagrams next." "I do hope so," Miss Marple said mildly. "They can be so clarifying. Tell me, was Mrs. Pennington's tea prepared in her own room?" "No, the maid took it up from the kitchen." Said she left it on the table when her mistress rang for her to fetch a shawl. When she returned, Mrs. Pennington had already drunk it. Then, Miss Marple said softly, it was not Mrs. Pennington's hand that added the sugar. Craddock stared. You think Archer? No, she said, shaking her head. Archer may have arranged it, but he did not deliver it. He wouldn't have dared return so soon. No, the person who sweetened that tea was someone inside the house. Someone Mrs. Pennington trusted implicitly. The inspector frowned. The maid? Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was remembering the girl, pale, anxious Mary Hobbs, who had helped the bride dress on the morning of the wedding. The same girl who had been dismissed after the tragedy, only to be rehired when Mrs. Pennington took ill. Tell me, she said finally, what do you know of this maid's mother? Not much, Craddock admitted. Widow, lives on Mill Lane, keeps to herself. Miss Marple's fingers drummed lightly on the table. She used to work in London, did she not? For a family called Archer some years ago. That's what Mrs. Bantry told me only yesterday. Small world, isn't it? Craddock straightened. You think Archer used her? That he bribed the maid? I think, Miss Marple said, that Mr. Archer had a talent for exploiting the loyalties of others. He would never risk poisoning Mrs. Pennington himself, but he might have sent a message, something convincing enough to persuade a frightened girl that she was only helping her mistress rest. A drop of medicine, perhaps, mixed with the sugar. Craddock rubbed his jaw. Then we'll need to bring her in for questioning. Not yet, Miss Marple said quickly. If she truly acted under his influence, she'll deny everything. And besides, there's something more at stake than guilt. There's understanding. Mrs. Pennington was silenced because she knew too much. But what if there was still something else hidden? Something Archer didn't recover in that churchyard? You think there's more evidence? Miss Marple nodded. A clever man like Archer would never leave a trail unless forced. But he miscalculated one thing, the character of Eliza Trent. She was thorough, determined, and rather more intelligent than those around her realized. If she knew the truth about the fraud, she would have ensured it couldn't be buried entirely. Craddock frowned. You mean she left something behind? Exactly, Miss Marple said. And I think I know where. You see, when we first found her body, there was one detail everyone overlooked, the bouquet. It had fallen into the mud, yes, but not by accident. It was clenched in her hand, crushed as though she'd grasped it tightly before she died. Brides carry many symbols, Inspector, but flowers fade. Letters, however, endure. Craddock's eyes widened. You think she hid a message in the bouquet? I think she hid a piece of evidence, Miss Marple said. A small thing, easily missed, perhaps a key, perhaps a slip of paper. Something she meant to give Harold after the ceremony. That's why she went to the vestry early. She was waiting to pass it to him, and that's what Archer was truly looking for in the garden. Craddock grabbed his hat. Then let's go. They arrived at the church just as the afternoon light began to wane. The garden, still damp from the morning dew, looked deceptively peaceful. Miss Marple led the way to the small stone step where the bride had fallen. Here, she said quietly. This is where she dropped it. Craddock crouched, scanning the ground. We've searched this spot a dozen times. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, my dear Inspector, men always look for things on the ground, never beneath it. Flowers have roots, after all. She knelt, her gloved fingers brushing aside the soil near the edge of the flower bed. Within moments, the tip of something metallic glinted faintly. Craddock helped her unearth it. A small silver key tarnished by damp, its handle engraved with 2 initials, E.T. Craddock turned it over in his hand. A key, he murmured. But to what? Miss Marple rose, her expression thoughtful. To the truth, Inspector. And if I'm not mistaken, to a box or drawer that once belonged to Eliza herself. Wherever it is, it will hold the evidence she meant to reveal. He looked at her with new urgency. And Archer didn't find it. No, she said softly. But he knows now that we have. Which means, Inspector, that he'll do something very foolish before the day is over. Craddock's face hardened. Then we'd better be ready for him. As they left the churchyard, the sun slipped behind the trees, casting long, uneven shadows across the graves. Miss Marple walked in silence beside the inspector, her mind already moving ahead to the next inevitable moment. Archer was cornered, desperate, and still dangerous. The pattern was nearly complete, but the final thread had yet to tighten, and when it did, she knew the truth would not simply emerge, it would unravel. The churchyard lay quiet behind them as Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock made their way back toward the village, the silver key clutched carefully in the inspector's gloved hand. The sun had already begun to sink behind the rooftops, casting the hedgerows in long ribbons of amber and shadow. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, and the sound seemed to echo oddly, hollow against the stillness that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple walked in silence, her steps steady, her expression pensive. It was the silence of thought, not fatigue. She had begun to see the shape of the end, faintly, like the outline of a figure behind a curtain, but the details still lingered just out of reach. At the edge of the green, Craddock finally spoke. "I've sent word to the station," he said. "We'll have men check through every one of Eliza Trent's belongings. If this key fits anything, we'll find it." Miss Marple nodded absently. "Do you know if her things were brought to the vicarage?" He frowned. "Yes, some of them were. The vicar's sister packed them for safekeeping after the funeral arrangements were made." "Why?" "Because," Miss Marple said softly, "if Eliza was the sort of girl I believe she was, she would have kept something close to her, something too important to trust to a trunk or drawer. Women are sentimental creatures, Inspector. They hide what matters most in plain sight. A diary, perhaps, or a keepsake box, something small enough to carry and ordinary enough to overlook." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "And you think that's what the key opens? I should be very much surprised if it didn't." They found Mildred Lawrence at the vicarage, bustling about the parlor with her usual air of nervous industry. When Miss Marple explained their errand, she clucked sympathetically and led them upstairs to the small guest room where Eliza's belongings had been stored. "There's not much, poor girl," she said, opening the door. "A few dresses, a traveling case, and that little writing desk. Such a pretty piece, though quite old-fashioned. I meant to have it dusted." Miss Marple's eyes went immediately to the desk. A delicate mahogany affair with small drawers and brass fittings, its surface polished to a soft glow. She approached it slowly, her gaze sharp despite her gentle demeanor. "How thoughtful of you to keep it, dear Mildred. Might I see whether this key belongs to it?" Mildred blinked. "Of course, Jane, but I should think any key would do." Her voice trailed off as the tiny silver key slid perfectly into the lock and turned with a soft click. Craddock bent forward, holding his breath as Miss Marple lifted the lid. Inside lay a small bundle of papers, tied neatly with a faded ribbon. The topmost sheet was a letter, written in a careful, slanting hand. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and began to read aloud, her voice quiet but clear. "If anything should happen to me, let it be known that I have discovered proof of fraud within the firm of Pennington and Archer. The documents enclosed will show that money was taken from the EEI accounts of clients now deceased. Mr. Archer was the author of the scheme, but Mrs. Pennington, whether through ignorance or fear, assisted him in its concealment. I had hoped to make all right again by marrying Harold, who knows nothing of it, but my conscience will not let me. Should I die before this reaches him, I beg that it be given to the authorities." There was silence when she finished, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Craddock exhaled slowly. "That's it, the whole case. Proof in her own hand. We'll have Archer convicted before the week is out." Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Her eyes were still on the paper, her expression thoughtful rather than satisfied. "Yes," she said at last, "and yet it is a very strange thing, Inspector. Don't you find it odd that Eliza should write such a letter and then carry the key with her to the church? If she truly feared for her life, wouldn't she have left the desk in someone else's care?" Craddock frowned. "You think she meant to give it to Harold?" Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. And that, I believe, was what brought her to the vestry that morning. She intended to tell him everything, to free herself from the shadow of deceit. But someone got to her first." Craddock's expression darkened. "Archer?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Or perhaps not only Archer." He looked sharply at her. "You mean there's someone else?" She hesitated before replying, her gaze drifting to the small window where the last of the daylight shimmered through the glass. "I think perhaps there was another who knew. Someone who understood that Eliza's confession would not only ruin Archer, but destroy the family name entirely. Mrs. Pennington may have been part of it, yes, but Harold had more to lose than either of them." Craddock stared at her, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "You can't mean—" "Oh, I don't mean anything yet," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "But I do observe, and what I observed at the church, the groom's composure, his lack of genuine surprise, was not the shock of a man whose bride had died suddenly. It was something colder, a kind of terrible realization." Craddock shook his head. "No, Miss Marple. Harold's as innocent as a lamb. Everyone says so." She smiled faintly. "Ah, but lambs are seldom innocent, Inspector. They are simply thought to be so because they bleat sweetly." They took the papers to the station that evening, and Craddock arranged for a constable to guard the vicarage in case anyone tried to reclaim what had been found. Yet as Miss Marple walked home, alone through the darkened lane, a sense of unease prickled at the edge of her thoughts. The night was windless, the air thick with the scent of damp leaves. Somewhere behind her, footsteps echoed faintly on the cobbles. She turned, but saw no one. Only the shifting shadow of the yew trees that lined the Eyes churchyard wall. When she reached her cottage, she found a note waiting on the table, slipped beneath the door. The handwriting was precise, almost elegant. "You've gone too far, Miss Marple. Leave this matter be, or the next funeral in St. Mary Mead will be yours." For a long moment she stood motionless, the note trembling slightly between her fingers. Then, with a small sigh, she folded it neatly and placed it beside her teacup. "Oh dear," she murmured. "Threats are such vulgar things, and they always come when one is very close to the truth." She locked the door and drew the curtains, but she did not sleep. Instead, she sat by the fire, her knitting untouched, her thoughts moving with slow, deliberate precision. The key, the papers, the warning, all pointed to a single, inescapable conclusion. Archer might have forged and deceived, but someone else had driven the final nail into the coffin of Eliza Trent. Someone close enough to silence both Eliza and Mrs. Pennington before their secrets reached daylight. When dawn came, Miss Marple rose from her chair, weary but resolute. She dressed carefully, choosing a plain grey coat and her oldest hat, the kind that made her look every inch the harmless old lady she so often pretended to be. Then she took her umbrella and stepped out into the pale morning light. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived at his office, she was already waiting there, her expression serene but her eyes sharp as steel. "Inspector," she said calmly, "I believe it's time we paid a visit to Mr. Harold Pennington. You see, I think he has one more wedding gift to return, and I fear he's not the sort to wait for an invitation." Craddock frowned, alarmed. "You think he's dangerous?" "Oh," Miss Marple said, a faint smile touching her lips. "Not dangerous, exactly. Merely desperate. And desperation, as I've learned, makes gentlemen behave in the most ungentlemanly ways." She straightened her gloves, her voice soft but certain. "Shall we go?" And as they left together, the wind stirred through the village once more, rattling the sign above the church gate. It seemed almost to whisper, carrying the faintest echo of the words that had started it all. The bride who never left the church. The morning sun filtered weakly through the gauze of low clouds as Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock approached the Pennington house once again. The path up to the door glistened faintly with dew, and a solitary robin perched upon the gatepost, its bright eye watching as if it too sensed that something was about to shift. Inside, the house was silent save for the creak of old wood and the faint ticking of a clock. A maid answered their knock, a different one this time, pale and wary, and led them to the drawing-room where Harold Pennington sat by the fire. He looked altered, though not in the way grief alters most men. There was no trace of tears, no slump of sorrow. Instead, there was an unnatural composure about him, a smooth, deliberate stillness that betrayed strain more than calm. His eyes, when they lifted to meet theirs, were cold and guarded. "Inspector," he said quietly, rising, "and Miss Marple, I suppose you've come to question me again. It seems my family's misfortunes are not yet complete." Craddock did not sit. "We've found new evidence," he said evenly. "A letter written by Miss Trent and papers from her personal desk. They confirm what she knew about the fraud at Pennington and Archer." Harold's expression did not change, but his hands tightened slightly on the back of the chair. "Then you have Archer's guilt in writing. I trust that means this wretched business will soon be over." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing him, spoke for the first time. Her tone was gentle, almost conversational. "Yes, one might hope so, though it is curious, isn't it, how such letters tend to survive the very people who write them. Eliza must have been a very careful young woman." Harold glanced at her sharply. "She was intelligent," he said curtly. "Too much so for her own good." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "and perhaps too perceptive as well. A dangerous combination, intelligence and perception, especially when one sees more than one ought." There was a flicker in his eyes then, something almost involuntary, and she saw it as clearly as if he had spoken aloud. Craddock cleared his throat. "We'll need to take another look at your study, Mr. Pennington. Routine, you understand?" Harold hesitated a fraction too long before replying. "Of course. You'll find nothing there." He led them down the corridor to a room panelled in dark oak, where shelves of law books lined the walls and papers lay neatly stacked upon the desk. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and ink. Craddock began to examine the drawers, while Miss Marple wandered slowly about, her eyes tracing the room's quiet order. It was a lawyer's space, precise, methodical, restrained. But to her, it felt oddly hollow, as though something essential had been stripped from it. She paused by the fireplace, noting a faint discoloration on the grate, the residue of paper ash, too recent to belong to the last evening's fire. Her gaze lingered there a moment before she spoke. "I wonder, Mr. Pennington, whether your mother often came in here. She must have been quite proud of this room. Her husband's study, was it not?" He turned slightly, his tone clipped. "It was. And yes, she valued it." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the mantelpiece. "I should think she valued appearances above all. Such a fine family name to uphold, such a reputation to maintain. It must have been rather a burden, especially when the truth began to threaten it." He stiffened. "I don't see what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," she said softly. "You see, your mother told me something before she died. That Eliza had written another letter. She meant to give it to you, to tell you everything, but she never had the chance. You see, I've often wondered why Eliza went to the vestry early that morning. It wasn't nerves nor hesitation. She went because someone summoned her, someone she trusted." Craddock turned from the desk, his brow furrowed. "You mean—" "Yes," Miss Marple said, her eyes fixed on Harold. "It wasn't Mrs. Pennington who sent for her. It was you. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "That's absurd," he said sharply. "I was with Peter Latham, my clerk, until the service began." Miss Marple's voice remained mild. "For a few minutes, yes, but not before that. You left the churchyard to fetch him. You said so yourself. And yet, curiously, no one saw you arrive from the vicarage side, though the path was in full view. I think you went round the back instead, to the vestry garden where Eliza was waiting. You'd learned of the letter, perhaps from Archer, perhaps from your mother, and you meant to stop her before she could speak." Craddock's hand went instinctively to his notebook, but Miss Marple lifted a hand, silencing him. Her gaze did not waver. "I dare say you didn't mean to harm her, but she resisted you, didn't she? She told you she'd already written it all down, that she would expose everything, and in that moment, oh, not out of cruelty, but panic, you pushed her, just enough to make her stumble, and when she fell, it was too late to call for help." Harold's face had gone very still. "You're mad," he whispered. "You have no proof." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Only human nature. You see, I've known many men who've killed. Not out of hatred, but fear. Fear of losing what they've built, of seeing their names in ruin. And you, Mr. Pennington, were never driven by greed as Archer was. You were driven by shame." For a moment, the room was utterly silent. Then, slowly, Harold's hand dropped from the back of the chair. His voice, when he spoke, was calm again. Too calm. "You're very clever, Miss Marple. Clever enough to imagine what others can't. But imagination isn't evidence." Craddock took a step forward. "Maybe not. But we've found the letter. We've got Archer's confession of fraud. If we find even a trace of Eliza's blood on your shoes or clothes—" Harold laughed suddenly, a sharp, hollow sound. "You won't. I burned them long ago, and you'll find nothing else either. Archer's in custody. The world will believe it was all his doing. My mother's dead. The witnesses are gone. There's no one left to contradict me." Miss Marple regarded him with deep sadness. "Oh, Mr. Pennington," she said softly, "there's always one thing left." He stared at her, puzzled. "What?" "The truth," she said. At that moment, the faint creak of the door interrupted them. A timid voice came from the hall. "Mr. Pennington, beg pardon, sir, but there's someone to see you." It was Mary Hobbs, the maid, her eyes wide and frightened. Behind her stood Peter Latham, the young clerk, his face pale but resolute. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, "but I had to come. I can't keep quiet any longer. I saw you that morning. You were in the vestry before anyone else. I didn't want to believe it, but—" Harold turned on him with a sudden ferocity, his composure shattering like glass. "You fool!" he shouted, taking a step forward. "You think they'll believe you over me?" But Craddock was faster. In 2 strides he had seized Harold's arm, twisting it behind his back as the man struggled briefly, then sagged, defeated. The fight had gone out of him as quickly as it had risen. When it was over, he sat slumped in the chair, his head bowed. "She was going to ruin everything," he said hoarsely. "I loved her, but she wouldn't listen. She wanted to drag my family into the gutter. I couldn't let her." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, her voice gentle. "No, of course not. Pride is a terrible thing, Mr. Pennington. It blinds good men far more surely than hatred ever could." Craddock led him away quietly, and when the room was empty, Miss Marple turned to the fireplace once more. The last traces of ash were cold now, but she could still imagine the moment they'd burned, letters, garments, perhaps even the remnants of a life he'd tried so desperately to erase. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, rustling through the trees. She stood at the window, watching as the church spire came into view beyond the rooftops. For a long while, she did not move. Then she drew her shawl more tightly about her shoulders and murmured, almost to herself, "The bride who never left the church, and the man who never truly did either." When she finally turned away, it was with the quiet certainty of one who has seen too much of human frailty to be surprised by it, and who, in her gentle, unassuming way, had once again restored the fragile order on a village that would go on gossiping about weddings and deaths and secrets, just as it always had. It was several days later, and the village of St. Mary Mead was settling, at last, back into its familiar rhythm. The scandal had burned through gossip and speculation like a fever, and now only a faint echo remained. A name murmured over tea, a sigh of disapproval, a shake of the head when the church bell tolled on Sunday. Mr. Harold Pennington was in custody, awaiting trial for the deaths of both Eliza Trent and his mother, while Charles Archer faced his own reckoning in London for fraud and forgery. To outward appearances, justice had been done, and yet, as always, Miss Marple saw the quieter truths that others preferred not to notice, the sorrow behind the relief, the pity beneath the moralizing. She sat in her garden that afternoon, pruning the roses while the air hummed softly with bees. A pot of tea steamed beside her, and a plate of shortbread rested on the small wrought-iron table. Inspector Craddock arrived, as he often did these days, looking both grateful and slightly embarrassed, the expression of a man who found himself repeatedly outmatched by a lady armed with nothing but observation and common sense. He removed his hat as he approached. "I thought I'd stop by to tell you it's all wrapped up. The Crown's satisfied, the papers have their story, and Archer's confession matches your theory almost word for word. I must say, Miss Marple, I don't know how you manage it." Miss Marple smiled faintly, brushing a fallen petal from her lap. "Oh, my dear Inspector, it isn't such a mystery. People are much alike, whether they're from Mayfair or St. Mary Mead. They all do the wrong thing for the right reason, or the right thing far too late." Craddock chuckled, shaking his head. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you almost pity him." "I do," she said quietly. "Poor Harold. He wasn't wicked, not truly, only proud. He built his life on the illusion of goodness, and when that illusion was threatened, he lost the courage to face the truth. It's a common failing, I'm afraid." He leaned against the gate, watching her deft fingers snip away a wilted blossom. "And Miss Trent?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. She was very brave. She could have stayed silent and lived comfortably enough, but conscience is a troublesome companion. She did what she believed was right, even knowing what it might cost her. One must respect that, and in her way, she won. The truth came out as she meant it to. The dead are often better detectives than the living, don't you think? Craddock smiled ruefully. "If that's true, I'd best retire before I embarrass myself." She laughed gently. "Oh no, Inspector. You'll go on quite nicely, I'm sure. You have patience, which is rarer than brilliance, and you don't mind being wrong now and then, another virtue not often found in your profession." He raised an eyebrow. "Is that a compliment?" "It's the highest I can give," she said serenely. For a while they sat in companionable silence. The church bell chimed the hour, and the faint scent of lilac drifted on the air. Life, it seemed, was already stitching itself back together, the ripples of tragedy fading into the steady rhythm of ordinary days. Children's laughter floated faintly from the green, where the village fair was being set up again, as though time itself refused to pause too long for grief. At last, Craddock straightened and put on his hat. "Well, Miss Marple, I'll leave you to your roses. I dare say you'll find another mystery soon enough. You always do." Miss Marple smiled, her gaze distant, the hint of amusement in her eyes. "Oh, I shouldn't think so, Inspector. I've had quite enough excitement for one summer. A quiet garden, a good book, and the occasional gossip. Those are quite sufficient for me." But when he had gone, and the lane was still again, she sat back and looked toward the church spire rising beyond the trees. Its stone gleamed pale in the late afternoon light, serene and eternal, untouched by the human dramas played out beneath it. She thought of Eliza Trent, the bride who never left the church, and of the way truth, once buried, had finally risen through the soil like the first shoots of spring. For all its tragedy, it had been a very ordinary story in the end. Love, pride, deceit, and fear, the eternal ingredients of human folly. And Miss Marple, who understood those things better than most, could not bring herself to condemn too harshly. She poured herself another cup of tea and smiled faintly into the quiet. "In the end," she murmured, "people never really change. Only the circumstances do. But one mustn't despair of them. Even weeds have their place in the garden after all." The wind stirred the roses, scattering a few petals across the grass like fragments of a forgotten veil. Miss Marple watched them fall, her expression gentle, almost wistful. Then, with a small sigh, she set down her teacup, gathered her pruning shears, and turned back to her work, as peaceful and precise as ever, tending her little corner of the world while all around her life went quietly on. And so, in the village of St. Mary Mead, where tragedy had bloomed like an unexpected frost, order was restored once more. Not by force, nor by the law, but by the quiet wisdom of an old woman who saw clearly the simple truth at the heart of every human mystery. ChatGPT can make mistakes. OpenAI doesn't use Amir's workspace data to train its models. ChatGPT says it was several days later, and the village of St. Mary Mead was settling, at last, back into its familiar rhythm. The scandal had burned through gossip and speculation like a fever, and now only a faint echo remained. A name murmured over tea, a sigh of disapproval, a shake of the head when the church bell tolled on Sunday. Mr. Harold Pennington was in custody, awaiting trial for the deaths of both Eliza Trent and his mother, while Charles Archer faced his own reckoning in London for fraud and forgery. To outward appearances, justice had been done, and yet, as always, Miss Marple saw the quieter truths that others preferred not to notice, the sorrow behind the relief, the pity beneath the moralizing. She sat in her garden that afternoon, pruning the roses while the air hummed softly with bees. A pot of tea steamed beside her, and a plate of shortbread rested on the small wrought-iron table. Inspector Craddock arrived, as he often did these days, looking both grateful and slightly embarrassed, the expression of a man who found himself repeatedly outmatched by a lady armed with nothing but observation and common sense. He removed his hat as he approached. "I thought I'd stop by to tell you it's all wrapped up. The Crown's satisfied, the papers have their story, and Archer's confession matches your theory, almost word for word. I must say, Miss Marple, I don't know how you manage it." Miss Marple smiled faintly, brushing a fallen petal from her lap. "Oh, my dear Inspector, it isn't such a mystery. People are much alike, whether they're from Mayfair or St. Mary Mead. They all do the wrong thing for the right reason, or the right thing far too late." Craddock chuckled, shaking his head. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you almost pity him." "I do," she said quietly. "Poor Harold. He wasn't wicked. Not truly. Only proud. He built his life on the illusion of goodness, and when that illusion was threatened, he lost the courage to face the truth. It's a common failing, I'm afraid." He leaned against the gate, watching her deft fingers snip away a wilted blossom. "And Miss Trent?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "She was very brave. She could have stayed silent and lived comfortably enough, but conscience is a troublesome companion. She did what she believed was right, even knowing what it might cost her. One must respect that, and in her way, she won. The truth came out as she meant it to. The dead are often better detectives than the living, don't you think?" Craddock smiled ruefully. "If that's true, I'd best retire before I embarrass myself." She laughed gently. "Oh no, Inspector. You'll go on quite nicely, I'm sure. You have patience, which is rarer than brilliance. And you don't mind being wrong now and then, another virtue not often found in your profession." He raised an eyebrow. "Is that a compliment?" "It's the highest I can give." she said serenely. For a while, they sat in companionable silence. The church bell chimed the hour, and the faint scent of lilac drifted on the air. Life, it seemed, was already stitching itself back together, the ripples of tragedy fading into the steady rhythm of ordinary days. Children's laughter floated faintly from the green, where the village fair was being set up again, as though time itself refused to pause too long for grief. At last, Craddock straightened and put on his hat. "Well, Miss Marple, I'll leave you to your roses. I dare say you'll find another mystery soon enough. You always do." Miss Marple smiled, her gaze distant, the hint of amusement in her eyes. "Oh, I shouldn't think so, Inspector. I've had quite enough excitement for one summer. A quiet garden, a good book, and the occasional gossip. Those are quite sufficient for me." But when he had gone and the lane was still again, she sat back and looked toward the church spire rising beyond the trees. Its stone gleamed pale in the late afternoon light, serene and eternal, untouched by the human dramas played out beneath it. She thought of Eliza Trent, the bride who never left the church, and of the way truth, once buried, had finally risen through the soil like the first shoots of spring. For all its tragedy, it had been a very ordinary story in the end. Love, pride, deceit and fear, the eternal ingredients of human folly. And Miss Marple, who understood those things better than most, could not bring herself to condemn too harshly. She poured herself another cup of tea and smiled faintly into the quiet. "In the end," she murmured, "people never really change. Only the circumstances do. But one mustn't despair of them. Even weeds have their place in the garden, after all." The wind stirred the roses, scattering a few petals across the grass like fragments of a forgotten veil. Miss Marple watched them fall, her expression gentle, almost wistful. Then, with a small sigh, she set down her teacup, gathered her pruning shears, and turned back to her work, as peaceful and precise as ever, tending her little corner of the world while all around her, life went quietly on. And so, in the village of St. Mary Mead, where tragedy had bloomed like an unexpected frost, order was restored once more, not by force nor by the law, but by the quiet wisdom of an old woman who saw clearly the simple truth at the heart of every human mystery. Human mystery, 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 human